In the scorching summer of 1892, the Montana Territory stretched like a painted canvas under an unforgiving sun, where men measured their worth in cattle brands and the size of their spreads. The valley of Copper Creek lay nestled between rolling hills that shimmered with heat waves, and the town of Redstone Creek sat like a collection of weathered bones against the endless sky. It was here that honor and greed would collide in ways that would shake the very foundations of what it meant to be a man of the West. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Redstone Creek as Jake Mitchell guided his sorrel mare toward Murphy's trading post, the leather of his saddle creaking in rhythm with his horse's steady gait. At 28, Jake had the weathered hands of a man who'd spent his life working cattle, but his eyes still held the clarity of someone who believed in doing right by others. His clothes were clean but worn, patched in places where barbed wire had torn through during long nights mending fences under starlight. The hat on his head had belonged to his father, and the boots on his feet had walked more miles than most men would cover in a lifetime. Redstone Creek wasn't much to look at, truth be told. A handful of wooden buildings lined the main thoroughfare, their paint peeling from years of harsh winters and blazing summers. The saloon stood at one end, Murphy's trading post at the other, with the sheriff's office, the church, and a few other establishments scattered between like afterthoughts. But for all its humble appearance, the town buzzed with the energy of opportunity. Cattle drives passed through regularly, bringing cowboys with jingling pockets and stories of distant places. Railroad surveyors had been spotted in the area, talking of tracks that would connect this remote valley to the larger world beyond. Jake had been working the smaller ranches around the valley for the better part of 5 years, ever since he'd drifted into Montana Territory from Colorado. He wasn't running from anything in particular, just following the work and the seasons like so many men did in those days. He'd earned a reputation as a reliable hand, someone who could gentle a wild bronc, track a lost steer through rough country, and keep his word when he gave it. Ranch owners knew they could count on Jake Mitchell to show up when he said he would, and work until the job was done. His own spread was modest, a small cabin he'd built with his own hands on a piece of land he'd been able to purchase after 3 good seasons of steady work. It sat beside Willow Creek, where cottonwoods provided shade in the summer and shelter from the wind in winter. He ran maybe 50 head of cattle, enough to keep him fed and clothed, with a little left over to save toward expanding his herd. It wasn't much compared to the big outfits that controlled thousands of acres, but it was his, and that meant everything to a man who'd grown up with nothing but the clothes on his back and the skills his father had taught him before consumption took him in the winter of '85. The drought that summer had been particularly harsh. Wells that had never run dry were showing their sandy bottoms, and the grass that usually grew knee-high was sparse and brown. Cattle clustered around the few remaining water sources, their ribs showing despite their owners' best efforts to find adequate grazing. Some of the smaller ranchers were already talking about selling out, taking whatever they could get and heading back east, where the rain fell more regularly and a man didn't have to fight the land quite so hard just to survive. Jake had managed better than most, partly due to his location near Willow Creek, which still ran with enough water to keep his small herd healthy, and partly because he'd learned to read the weather patterns and prepare for lean times. But he was feeling the pinch. The price of hay had tripled, and the cattle buyers weren't offering nearly what they had the year before. Still, he'd weathered hard times before, and he figured he'd weather them again if he was careful and didn't take unnecessary risks. It was on this particular morning, as he tied his mare to the hitching post outside Murphy's trading post, that Jake first heard about the trouble brewing up at Whispering Pine Ridge. Murphy himself was standing on the wooden porch, talking in low tones with Bill Hawkins, the deputy sheriff, and Doc Harrison, who served the valley's medical needs when he wasn't too deep in his cups to hold a steady hand. Thomas Ravenfeather and his people have been camping up there for near on 2 weeks now, Murphy was saying, his voice carrying the tone of a man discussing a problem that needed solving. Crawford's getting mighty worked up about it, says they're interfering with his cattle operation. Something about sacred burial grounds or some such nonsense. Jake knew the name Samuel Crawford well enough. Everyone in the valley did. Crawford owned the Triple C Ranch, the largest spread in 3 counties, with more cattle than some small towns had people. He'd arrived in Montana Territory about 10 years prior, with money from back east and the kind of ambition that didn't take kindly to obstacles. His ranch house was said to be grander than anything in the territorial capital, with imported furniture and servants who'd traveled all the way from San Francisco to work for him. Crawford had a way of getting what he wanted, whether through legal means or otherwise, and he didn't much care for anyone who stood in his way. Thomas Ravenfeather was a different sort of man entirely. Jake had encountered him a few times over the years, usually when their paths crossed at the trading post or during one of the seasonal gatherings that brought together ranchers, cowboys, and the various tribal people who still lived in the area, despite the government's efforts to relocate them to reservations further south. Thomas was a Lakota elder, probably somewhere around 67 years old, with silver hair that he wore in traditional braids and eyes that seemed to see more than most folks were comfortable with. He spoke English as well as anyone, having learned it during his years at the boarding school the government had sent him to as a boy, but he preferred to conduct important business in his native tongue, using his granddaughter Maria as a translator when dealing with white officials. The burial grounds on Whispering Pine Ridge had been a source of tension for several years. The area was technically part of Crawford's ranch, having been included in the massive land grant he'd purchased from the territorial government. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But the Lakota people considered it sacred ground, where their ancestors had been laid to rest long before any white man had set foot in the valley. The graves were marked with stones arranged in traditional patterns, and the area was said to be protected by the spirits of those who rested there. Most of the local ranchers had learned to give the burial grounds a wide berth, not out of any particular respect for native traditions, but because it generally wasn't worth the trouble that came with disturbing them. Cattle that grazed too close to the sacred sites often disappeared or were found dead under mysterious circumstances. Cowboys who rode through the area reported strange sounds and unexplained phenomena that made their horses skittish and their sleep restless. Even the most hardened skeptics admitted there was something different about Whispering Pine Ridge, something that made a man think twice before trespassing. But Crawford wasn't like most ranchers. He'd made his fortune by taking what he wanted and dealing with the consequences later. The drought had forced him to look for new grazing areas, and the grass around Whispering Pine Ridge was some of the best in the valley, fed by an underground spring that had kept it green even during the driest months. He'd started moving cattle into the area gradually, testing to see what kind of resistance he'd face. When Thomas Ravenfeather had appeared with a small group of his people to establish a protective presence around the graves, Crawford had seen it as a direct challenge to his authority. Jake finished his business at the trading post, purchasing the supplies he needed for the coming week, and was preparing to mount his horse when he noticed the dust cloud approaching from the north. A large group of riders was heading toward town at a steady pace, and even from a distance, Jake could tell they meant business. The lead rider was a big man on a black stallion, wearing a white hat and a coat that probably cost more than most cowboys earned in a month. Samuel Crawford had come to town, and he'd brought what looked like most of his crew with him. The ranch owner dismounted in front of the sheriff's office with the confidence of a man who owned everything he could see and most of what he couldn't. His cowboys remained mounted, hands resting casually on their gun belts in a way that wasn't quite Threatening, but wasn't entirely peaceful either. Crawford was a handsome man in his mid-50s, with silver threading through his dark hair, and the kind of mustache that suggested he spent considerable time grooming it. His boots were polished, his clothes were tailored, and everything about him spoke of success and power. Sheriff Morrison emerged from his office before Crawford had even reached the door, which told Jake everything he needed to know about who really ran things in Redstone Creek. Morrison was a thin, nervous man who'd been elected more for his willingness to avoid trouble than for any particular skill at law enforcement. He shook Crawford's hand with the eagerness of a man greeting his employer rather than a citizen seeking justice. The conversation between Crawford and the sheriff was conducted in voices too low for Jake to overhear from across the street, but their body language told the story well enough. Crawford was explaining something with considerable animation, gesturing toward the north where Whispering Pine Ridge lay hidden beyond the rolling hills. Sheriff Morrison was nodding along with everything the rancher said, occasionally glancing toward his deputy, Bill Hawkins, as if seeking confirmation that he was handling the situation correctly. Jake had known Bill Hawkins for several years, and he'd never been particularly impressed with the man's character. Hawkins was the sort of lawman who measured justice by the size of a man's wallet and the influence of his friends. He wore his badge like it made him special, but everyone in the valley knew he'd gotten the job because his uncle had connections with the territorial government. Hawkins was quick to make arrests when it served Crawford's interests, and equally quick to look the other way when the rancher's men bent the law to their advantage. The meeting outside the sheriff's office lasted maybe 10 minutes before Crawford remounted his horse and led his men north toward his ranch. Sheriff Morrison watched them go with the expression of a man who'd just received orders he didn't particularly want to follow but didn't dare refuse. Jake had a sinking feeling in his stomach as he considered what those orders might entail. That evening, as Jake sat on the porch of his small cabin watching the sun set over the western hills, he found himself thinking about the situation at Whispering Pine Ridge. He'd never been particularly political, preferring to focus on his own affairs and let others worry about the larger issues that seemed to consume so much energy and cause so much trouble. But something about the morning's events had left him unsettled in a way he couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the memory of his father's stories about the old days, when cowboys and native peoples had found ways to coexist in the vast spaces of the frontier. His father had worked alongside Lakota and Cheyenne men during the early cattle drives, and he'd always spoken of them with respect. They knew the land better than anyone, could read weather patterns and find water sources that would save a herd during the worst droughts. They understood the rhythms of the seasons and the migration patterns of the buffalo herds that had once darkened the plains with their numbers. Or maybe it was simply Jake's innate sense of fairness, the code of honor that his father had instilled in him from childhood. A man protected what was sacred to him, whether that was his family, his land, or his word. And if someone else considered something sacred, a decent man found ways to respect that, even if he didn't fully understand it. The burial grounds on Whispering Pine Ridge might not mean anything to Samuel Crawford, but they clearly meant everything to Thomas Raven Feather and his people. Jake's mare nickered softly from the corral, drawing his attention back to the present moment. The first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. These were the sounds and sights that had drawn him to Montana territory in the first place, the sense of space and freedom that allowed a man to be himself without constantly worrying about what others thought. But that freedom came with responsibility, the obligation to stand up for what was right, even when it wasn't convenient or profitable. As he prepared for bed that night, Jake made a decision that would change the course of his life in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. Tomorrow he would ride north to Whispering Pine Ridge and see for himself what was happening there. He didn't know what he could do to help, if anything, but he figured a man had to try. Sometimes doing the right thing was more important than doing the smart thing. And Jake Mitchell had never been the kind of man to walk away from trouble when innocent. People needed help. The last thing he did before blowing out his lamp was to check his rifle and make sure his saddlebags contained everything he might need for a longer trip than usual. Something told him that tomorrow's ride to Whispering Pine Ridge would be the beginning of an adventure that would test everything he believed about himself and the world around him. The dawn air carried the scent of sagebrush and distant rain as Jake Mitchell saddled his mare in the pre-morning darkness. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking the cinch twice and ensuring his bedroll was properly secured behind. The cantle, the coffee he'd brewed over the small fire in his cabin, still steamed in the tin cup beside the corral gate, but his mind was already miles away, focused on the journey ahead and the memories that had shaped him into the man he'd become. Jake's father, Robert Mitchell, had been a different breed of cowboy than most men who worked the ranges in those days. Where others saw only profit and expansion, Robert had possessed an unusual respect for the indigenous peoples whose lands were being carved up and sold to the highest bidders. He'd learned this perspective the hard way during his early years working cattle drives through territories where tensions between settlers and tribal nations ran as hot as branding irons. It was during the summer of 1874 that Robert Mitchell's worldview had been fundamentally altered. He'd been working as a trail boss for an outfit driving cattle from Texas to Kansas when they'd encountered a band of Kiowa warriors who'd been tracking a group of buffalo hunters. The hunters had slaughtered an entire herd for their hides alone, leaving the meat to rot under the prairie sun, and the Kiowa were seeking justice for what they considered a sacred act of waste and disrespect. Most trail bosses would have circled the wagons and prepared for a fight, but Robert Mitchell had done something different. He'd ridden out alone to meet the war party, carrying nothing but a white cloth tied to a stick and the kind of courage that came from genuine conviction. Using a mixture of sign language and the few Kiowa words he'd picked up from previous encounters, he'd managed to convey his understanding of their anger and his own disgust at the hunters' wasteful actions. What followed was a conversation that lasted most of the afternoon, conducted in 3 languages and punctuated by long periods of thoughtful silence. The Kiowa leader, a man named Running Horse, had explained through gestures and broken English how the buffalo were considered relatives by his people, sacred beings whose sacrifice fed not just their bodies, but their spirits. To kill them for hides alone was not just wasteful but spiritually destructive, like burning down a church for its lumber while the congregation was still inside. Robert had shared his own understanding of the land as something to be respected rather than merely exploited, telling stories of his grandfather's farm in Ohio, where they'd rotated crops and allowed fields to lie fallow so the soil could renew itself. He'd spoken of his belief that men had a responsibility to take only what they needed and to give back more than they took, whether they were dealing with cattle, land, or relationships with other human beings. By the time the sun was setting behind them, an understanding had been reached. Running Horse would allow the cattle drive to pass through Kiowa territory unmolested, and Robert would carry word to other trail bosses about the importance of respecting tribal hunting grounds and sacred sites. More importantly, a friendship had been forged that would last until Robert's death nearly 20 years later. This story had been one of Jake's earliest lessons about the kind of man his father expected him to become. Honor wasn't just about keeping your word to people who looked like you or shared your beliefs. Real honor meant standing up for what was right even when it was difficult, even when it meant going against the prevailing wisdom of your peers. It meant understanding that the world was bigger than your own immediate concerns, and that every action had consequences that rippled out beyond what you could see. Robert Mitchell had carried these principles with him when he'd finally settled in Montana Territory, purchasing a small spread near what would eventually become Redstone Creek. He'd made it a point to maintain respectful relationships with the Lakota families who still hunted and gathered in the area, often trading cattle for horses or sharing information about weather patterns and game movements. When neighboring ranchers complained about his soft approach to dealing with Indians, Robert would simply point out that his cattle rarely went missing and his property was never vandalized, unlike theirs. Jake had grown up watching these interactions, learning from his father's example that strength came not from domination but from understanding. He'd been perhaps 12 years old when Thomas Ravenfeather had first appeared at their cabin, seeking medical help for his young granddaughter, who'd been badly injured in a fall from her horse. Robert had no formal medical training, but he'd learned basic field medicine during his years working cattle drives, and he'd managed to set the girl's broken arm and treat her various cuts and bruises. That granddaughter had been Maria Thunderhorse, and Jake could still remember the way she'd looked at him with curious, intelligent eyes while her grandfather and his father discussed the weather and the movements of various herds in the area. She'd been perhaps 10 years old then, with braids that reached nearly to her waist and a way of moving that suggested she was already completely at home in the wilderness that intimidated many adult men. Over the years, the relationship between the Mitchell and Ravenfeather families had deepened into something approaching genuine friendship. Thomas would stop by their cabin several times each year, sometimes bringing news of distant events or warnings about harsh weather approaching from the north. Robert would share information about cattle buyers and railroad, construction plans that might affect traditional hunting and gathering areas. It was a relationship built on mutual respect and practical cooperation, the kind of alliance that had been common in the early days of the frontier, but was becoming increasingly rare as economic pressures and racial tensions intensified. When consumption finally claimed Robert Mitchell in the harsh winter of 1887, Thomas Ravenfeather had been one of the mourners at his funeral. He'd spoken words in Lakota over the grave that Jake didn't understand but could feel in his bones. Prayers or blessings that seemed to carry the weight of genuine affection and respect. After the other mourners had departed, Thomas had placed a hand on Jake's shoulder and spoken the only words of English he'd uttered that day. "Your father was a man who understood that all things are connected. Honor his memory by remembering this truth." Those words had echoed in Jake's mind during the difficult years that followed, as he'd struggled to maintain the family ranch while dealing with his own grief and the practical challenges of working a spread that had been designed for 2 men rather than 1. He'd eventually been forced to sell most of the land, keeping only the small cabin and enough acreage for a modest herd. But he'd never forgotten the lessons his father had taught him about honor, respect, and the interconnectedness of all things. Now as he guided his mare through the pre-dawn darkness toward Whispering Pine Ridge, Jake found himself thinking about those lessons and wondering if the time had come to put them to a more serious test than anything he'd faced before. The situation with Crawford and the burial grounds wasn't just about land rights or economic interests. It was about the fundamental question of what kind of community Redstone Creek would become and what kind of man Jake Mitchell would prove himself to be when faced with a choice between profit and principle. The morning sun was painting the eastern hills with shades of gold and crimson by the time Jake reached the lower slopes of Whispering Pine Ridge. Even from a distance, he could see the smoke from several campfires rising into the still air, and his trained ear could pick up the sound of horses moving restlessly in a temporary corral. Thomas Ravenfeather and his people had established what appeared to be a substantial camp, suggesting they were prepared for a prolonged stay. As Jake drew closer, he began to make out individual figures moving among the tipis and lean-to shelters that dotted the camp. There were perhaps 20 people in total, ranging from elderly men and women to children who couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. They were going about their morning routines with the calm efficiency of people who'd done this many times before, tending fires, preparing food, and checking on the horses that represented their primary means of transportation and much of their wealth. The camp had been positioned with obvious strategic considerations in mind. It sat on a slight rise that provided excellent visibility in all directions, with good access to water from a spring-fed creek and enough grass to keep their horses healthy. More importantly, it was situated directly between the main approach to the burial grounds and the trails that Crawford's cowboys would need to use to move cattle into the area. Anyone wanting to disturb the sacred sites would have to deal with Thomas Rivenfeather and his people first. Jake was still perhaps a quarter-mile from the camp when he was met by two young Lakota men who'd obviously been posted as sentries. They rode with the easy confidence of people who'd grown up on horseback, their weapons carried in a way that was ready but not overtly threatening. One of them Jake recognized as Maria Thunderhorse's younger brother, Daniel, who'd grown from a skinny 12-year-old into a powerfully built man in his early 20s. The other sentry was unfamiliar, but his bearing and the quality of his horse and equipment suggested he was someone of importance within the group. Both men studied Jake with careful attention, clearly trying to determine whether he represented a threat or an opportunity. After a moment, Daniel urged his horse forward, raising his hand in greeting. "Jake Mitchell," Daniel said, his English carrying only the slightest accent. "My grandfather said you might come. He's been expecting you." The words sent a slight chill down Jake's spine, though he couldn't have explained exactly why. Thomas Rivenfeather had always possessed an uncanny ability to anticipate events and read the intentions of others, but the idea that he'd been expecting Jake's arrival suggested a level of foresight that bordered on the supernatural. Still, Jake had learned long ago not to question the old man's insights too closely. Whether they came from careful observation, deep wisdom, or something more mystical, they had a way of proving accurate. The three men rode together toward the camp, Jake's mare stepping carefully around the scattered sage and prairie dog holes that dotted the slope. As they drew closer, more people emerged from the tipis and shelters to watch their approach. Jake could feel their eyes on him, measuring and evaluating in the way that people did when they encountered a potential ally or enemy. He kept his hands visible and his posture relaxed, trying to project the kind of respectful neutrality that his father had taught him was essential when entering someone else's territory. Thomas Rivenfeather emerged from the largest tipi just as they reached the edge of the camp. The old man looked much as Jake remembered him, perhaps a bit more stooped with age but still carrying himself with the dignity and presence that had always characterized his interactions with others. His hair was completely silver now, braided with strips of leather and what appeared to be small pieces of carved bone. His clothes were a mixture of traditional and modern elements, buckskin leggings and moccasins paired with a cotton shirt that had probably been purchased at Murphy's Trading Post. Jake dismounted while still at a respectful distance and approached on foot, removing his hat as his father had taught him to do when greeting elders of any culture. Thomas watched his approach with eyes that seemed to take in everything about him, from the way he moved to the condition of his equipment, to the expression on his face. After a moment that felt much longer than it probably was, the old man nodded slowly and spoke. "Welcome, Jake Mitchell. Your father's son is always welcome in our camp. Come, we have much to discuss and little time in which to do it." Part 3. The Mysterious Catalyst. The interior of Thomas Rivenfeather's tipi was larger than Jake had expected, with buffalo robes covering the ground and various personal items arranged with careful precision around the central fire pit. The walls were decorated with paintings that depicted hunting scenes and spiritual visions, their colors still bright despite their obvious age. Bundles of sage and sweetgrass hung from the lodge poles, filling the air with a clean, sharp scent that somehow made breathing easier and thinking clearer. Thomas gestured for Jake to sit on a buffalo robe opposite the fire, then settled himself with the careful movements of a man whose joints had endured decades of hard living. For several minutes neither man spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but rather the kind of respectful quiet that allowed each person to take the measure of the other. Outside, Jake could hear the normal sounds of camp life continuing. Children laughing, horses snorting, the quiet. Conversations of adults going about their daily tasks. Finally, Thomas reached into a leather pouch beside him and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft doeskin. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing what appeared to be a piece of curved bone covered with intricate carvings. The bone was yellow, with age and polished smooth by countless hands, and the carvings seemed to shift and change in the flickering firelight, creating patterns that were difficult to focus on directly. "This belonged to my great-grandfather," Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of long tradition. "He was a holy man, a keeper of the old stories and the guardian of this sacred place we now protect. Before he died, he told me of a vision he had received, a vision of a time when the burial grounds would be threatened by men who saw only gold where others saw spirits." Jake leaned forward slightly, drawn by something in the old man's voice that suggested this story was more than simple history. The carved bone seemed to pulse with its own inner light, though he knew that had to be a trick of the firelight and his own imagination. Still, there was something about the object that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, as if he were in the presence of forces that existed beyond the normal boundaries of human understanding. "In this vision," Thomas continued, "my great-grandfather saw a young man with eyes like winter sky and hands marked by honest work. This man would come from the south when the sacred places were in greatest danger, and he would be called upon to choose between the easy path and the path of honor. The spirits told my great-grandfather that this choice would determine not only the fate of our burial grounds, but the spiritual future of the entire valley." The old man's eyes fixed on Jake with an intensity that made him feel as if his soul were being examined and weighed. He wanted to dismiss the story as superstition or coincidence, but something about the way Thomas spoke and the atmosphere within the tipi made skepticism difficult to maintain. There was a power in this place and in this moment that transcended his rational understanding of how the world worked. Thomas rewrapped the carved bone and returned it to its pouch, then reached for a different object, this one a leather folder secured with rawhide ties. He opened it carefully, revealing what appeared to be a collection of papers covered with both English text and Lakota pictographs. Some of the documents bore official seals and signatures, while others appeared to be hand-drawn maps and diagrams. 3 days ago, Thomas said, spreading several papers on the buffalo robe between them, we received word from friends in the territorial capital that Crawford has petitioned the government to have us removed from this area by force. He claims we are trespassing on his legal property and interfering with his legitimate business operations. The territorial governor is under pressure from wealthy ranchers throughout Montana to take a hard line against any Indian presence outside the established reservations. Jake studied the documents as best he could in the firelight, recognizing some of the legal terminology from his limited experience with land transactions and cattle contracts. What he saw made his stomach tighten with apprehension. The papers appeared to be a formal complaint requesting military intervention to remove the Lakota camp from Whispering Pine Ridge, citing various territorial statutes and federal regulations that gave local authorities broad powers to deal with what they termed vagrant Indian populations. But more disturbing than the legal maneuvering was a hand-drawn map that showed not just the immediate area around the burial grounds but a much larger section of the valley floor. Red ink marks indicated proposed routes for a railroad spur line that would connect the valley to the main transcontinental route, opening up opportunities for large-scale cattle shipping that could make men like Crawford wealthy beyond imagination. The burial grounds sat directly in the path of this proposed development, and it was clear that their presence represented more than just a minor inconvenience to Crawford's plans. However, Thomas continued, his voice taking on a different tone, we have also received other information that Crawford does not know we possess. Yesterday, A young woman arrived in our camp carrying news that changes everything we thought we understood about this situation. As if summoned by his words, the tipi entrance opened, and Maria Thunderhorse stepped inside. Jake had not seen her in several years, and he was struck by how she had changed from the curious child he remembered into a poised and intelligent woman. She moved with the same natural grace that had characterized her as a girl, but there was now a sense of purpose and determination in her bearing that spoke of someone who had faced serious challenges and emerged stronger. Maria wore a mixture of traditional and contemporary clothing, a beaded buckskin dress over practical riding boots, her long black hair braided with silver ornaments that caught the firelight. But it was her eyes that drew Jake's attention, dark and intelligent, with a depth that suggested she had seen more of the world than most people her age, regardless of their cultural background. Maria has been living in Denver for the past 3 years, Thomas explained, studying at the Territorial College and working with lawyers who specialize in Indian rights cases. She has learned to speak the white man's language not just with her voice but with his own laws and documents. What she discovered there will interest you greatly. Maria settled herself beside her grandfather with practiced ease, then withdrew a leather satchel from beneath her dress. From it, she produced a thick folder of papers that appeared to be official documents, bearing various territorial and federal seals. Her English was precise and unaccented, the result of years of formal education, but Jake could detect the underlying cadences of her native language in the rhythm of her speech. 3 weeks ago, she said, I was contacted by a clerk in the Territorial Land Office who had become suspicious about some of the paperwork surrounding Crawford's property claims. This man, a German immigrant named Klaus Brunnen, had noticed discrepancies in the survey documents and title transfers that suggested something irregular about how Crawford had acquired certain portions of his ranch. She opened the folder and spread several documents on the buffalo robe, pointing to specific sections as she spoke. What Brennan discovered was evidence that Crawford had been systematically falsifying survey reports and bribing territorial officials to overlook problems with his land claims. In several cases, he had claimed ownership of areas that had never actually been offered for sale by the government, including sections that were specifically designated as protected tribal territories under various federal treaties. Jake studied the documents, his understanding limited by their legal complexity, but sufficient to grasp the general implications of what Maria was describing. If her information was accurate, Crawford's legal claim to Whispering Pine Ridge was not just morally questionable, but completely fraudulent. The burial grounds were situated on land that had never legitimately been part of his ranch, regardless of what his deeds and survey maps might claim. But more significantly, Maria continued, Brennan also uncovered evidence of a larger conspiracy involving several territorial officials and railroad companies. Crawford's petition to have us removed from the burial grounds is just the first step in a plan to clear the entire valley of any obstacles to railroad development. Within 5 years, they intend to build not just a spur line, but a major rail depot that would transform this area into a center for cattle shipping throughout the Northern Territories. The implications of this revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. If Maria's information was correct, the current conflict over the burial grounds was just the beginning of a much larger transformation that would fundamentally alter the character of the entire valley. Small ranchers like himself would be squeezed out by the economic pressures of large-scale development, and the traditional ways of life that had sustained both white settlers and native peoples would be swept away in favor of industrial efficiency and corporate profit. Thomas had been watching Jake's face during Maria's explanation, and now he leaned forward with the intensity of a man delivering a message of critical importance. This is why the spirits brought you here, he said. The choice my great-grandfather saw in his vision is now before you. You can return to your cabin and your cattle and pretend that these events do not concern you. Many men would make that choice, and no one would blame you for it." The old man paused, allowing his words to settle in the warm air of the tipi before continuing. "Or you can stand with us in defense of what is sacred, knowing that doing so will make you enemies among your own people and cost you more than you can imagine. The spirits cannot tell us which path you will choose, only that the choice itself will shape the destiny of this valley for generations to come." Jake felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a physical force. Everything in his practical, rational mind told him to thank Thomas and Maria for their information, wish them well in their struggle, and ride back to his cabin to focus on his own survival during these difficult times. He was just one man with limited resources and no particular influence among the wealthy and powerful men who controlled the territory's political machinery. But his father's voice echoed in his memory, reminding him that honor was not about calculating odds or ensuring favorable outcomes. Honor was about doing what was right regardless of the personal cost, about standing up for those who could not stand up for themselves, about protecting what was sacred even when others saw only obstacles to profit. Outside the tipi, Jake could hear the sound of horses approaching at speed, their hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth with the rhythm of men riding with serious purpose. Thomas and Maria both tensed, their heads turning toward the sound, with the alertness of people who had learned to recognize the difference between friendly visitors and potential threats. Daniel Thunderhorse's voice called out from somewhere near the camp's perimeter, speaking rapidly in Lakota. Thomas responded in the same language, his tone sharp with sudden urgency. Maria was already moving toward the tipi entrance, her hand instinctively checking the knife at her belt. "What is it?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Crawford's men," Maria replied, her voice tight with controlled tension. 20 riders, maybe more, approaching from the south. They're armed and riding hard." Thomas stood with the careful deliberation of a man preparing for battle, his movements economical and precise despite his age. He reached for a rifle that had been lying beside his sleeping robes, checking the action with practiced efficiency. When he looked at Jake again, his eyes held a question that required no words to express. Jake Mitchell stood as well, his hand moving automatically to check his own weapon. The moment of choice had arrived sooner than any of them had expected, but perhaps that was fitting. Sometimes a man's character was revealed not in the decisions he made after careful deliberation, but in the instincts that guided him when time was too short for thought. "I reckon I've heard enough," Jake said, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. "If Crawford wants to disturb these graves, he'll have to go through me to do it." Part 4. Call to action moment. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder as Jake emerged from Thomas Ravenfeather's tipi, his eyes automatically scanning the terrain below to assess the tactical situation. The Lakota camp had been positioned with obvious defensive considerations in mind, but 20 armed men represented a formidable force, especially if they were willing to use violence to achieve their objectives. The morning sun was climbing higher now, burning off the last wisps of mist and providing clear visibility across the rolling grassland that stretched toward the south. Crawford's riders appeared as a dark line against the pale grass, moving in formation with the disciplined precision of men who had done this sort of thing before. Even at a distance, Jake could make out the distinctive white hat that marked Samuel Crawford himself, riding at the head of the group like a general leading his troops into battle. The sight sent a chill through him, not from fear but from the recognition that this confrontation would likely determine the fate of everyone involved. The camp around him was transforming with remarkable speed as the Lakota defenders prepared for whatever was coming. Women and children were being moved toward the back of the camp, closer to the creek where the terrain provided better cover and escape routes if things went badly. Men were checking weapons and positioning themselves behind whatever natural or improvised barriers they could find. The entire process was being carried out with minimal conversation, as if everyone understood their role without needing detailed instructions. Maria Thunderhorse appeared at Jake's side, carrying a rifle that looked well-maintained and frequently used. Her grandfather had armed himself as well, and Jake could see other camp members taking defensive positions among the rocks and brush that dotted the slope. Despite being outnumbered, the Lakota had chosen their ground well, with excellent fields of fire and multiple fallback positions if the situation deteriorated. Jake counted perhaps 15 adult men among the defenders, along with several women who were clearly prepared to fight if necessary. Against Crawford's 20 riders, those weren't terrible odds, especially considering the defensive advantages of their position. But Jake knew that raw numbers told only part of the story. Crawford's men would be well-armed and experienced in this kind of confrontation, and they had the backing of territorial law enforcement, which meant that any violence would likely be blamed on the Lakota defenders regardless of who actually started the shooting. Thomas Ravenfeather positioned himself near the center of the defensive line, his rifle held with the easy familiarity of a man who had used such weapons in serious situations before. Despite his age, there was nothing frail or uncertain about his movements. This was a warrior preparing for battle, drawing on decades of experience and a lifetime of defending his people against various threats. "They will try to provoke us into firing the first shot," Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly despite the tension in the air. "Crawford needs to be able to claim that we attacked his men while they were conducting legitimate business on his property. If we give him that excuse, the territorial authorities will have all the justification. They need to remove us by force and arrest anyone who survives the encounter." Jake nodded, understanding the tactical and political dimensions of what they were facing. Crawford wasn't just trying to drive them away from the burial grounds. He was setting up a scenario that would allow him to eliminate the Lakota presence in the valley permanently while maintaining the appearance of acting within the law. It was a calculated strategy that demonstrated both his ruthlessness and his understanding of how territorial politics actually worked. The approaching riders had slowed to a walk as they climbed the lower slopes of Whispering Pine Ridge, spreading out into a loose line that would allow them to surround the camp if that became necessary. Crawford himself remained in the center, flanked by men who Jake recognized as his foremen and several of his most trusted hands. The rest appeared to be a mixture of regular ranch employees and what looked like hired guns, men whose clothing and bearing suggested they made their living through violence rather than cattle work. As the riders drew closer, Jake could make out more details of their equipment and demeanor. Most carried rifles in addition to their sidearms, and several had ropes coiled and ready, suggesting they might be planning to make arrests rather than simply driving the Lakota away. The horses were fresh and well-fed, indicating that Crawford had planned this confrontation carefully rather than riding out in anger or haste. Crawford called a halt when his line was still about 100 yards from the camp, close enough for conversation, but far enough away to avoid immediate violence if tempers flared. He sat his black stallion with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his orders followed without question, his white hat gleaming in the morning sunlight like a beacon of authority. For several moments, he simply stared at the defensive positions, as if counting the defenders and assessing their readiness to fight. "Thomas Ravenfeather," Crawford called out finally, his voice carrying clearly across the distance between them. "You and your people are trespassing on my legal property and interfering with my legitimate business operations. I'm giving you one opportunity to pack up your camp and leave peacefully before I'm forced to take more serious action." The old Lakota leader rose from his position behind a cluster of rocks, making himself visible but keeping his rifle ready. His response was delivered in English, but with the formal cadences of someone translating thoughts originally formed in his native language. "Samuel Crawford," Thomas replied, his voice steady and strong despite his age. "This land was sacred to my people long before any white man set foot in this valley. Our ancestors rest in the earth beneath your feet, and we will not abandon them to satisfy your greed. If you have legal papers that say otherwise, present them to a territorial judge and let him decide who has the right to be here. Crawford's laugh was harsh and without humor. I don't need to justify my legal rights to a pack of vagrants and squatters, he said. This is my land, purchased and paid for according to territorial law, and I want you off it immediately. You have 10 minutes to start breaking camp, or I'll have my men remove you by whatever means necessary. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, heavy with the promise of violence. Jake could feel the tension ratcheting up among the defenders around him, men and women preparing themselves mentally for a fight that could leave many of them dead or wounded. This was the moment when words would either prevent bloodshed or prove inadequate to contain the forces that had been set in motion. It was then that Jake Mitchell made the decision that would define the rest of his life. Without conscious thought, he rose from his own position and walked slowly toward the open ground between the two groups. He could hear Thomas calling his name behind him, but he didn't stop or look back. Something deeper than rational calculation was driving him forward, a sense of moral obligation that transcended considerations of personal safety or practical consequences. Crawford's attention fixed on him immediately, his eyes narrowing as he tried to place this unexpected participant in what he had assumed would be a straightforward confrontation between himself and the Lakota defenders. Jake could see the rancher's mind working, trying to determine whether this new element represented an opportunity or a complication to his plans. "And who might you be?" Crawford asked, his tone carrying a mixture of curiosity and irritation. "This is a private matter between myself and these trespassers. I suggest you remove yourself from the area before you get caught up in something that doesn't concern you." Jake stopped when he was roughly halfway between the two groups, close enough to speak without shouting, but far enough from Crawford's men to avoid being easily captured or threatened. He removed his hat with deliberate courtesy, a gesture of respect that was also a signal that he intended to conduct this conversation according to the formal protocols of frontier diplomacy. "Name's Jake Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "I own a small spread down by Willow Creek, and I've been neighbors with Thomas Ravenfeather and his family for most of my adult life. I came here this morning because I heard there might be trouble, and I wanted to see for myself what was happening." Crawford's expression shifted slightly, his politician's instincts telling him that this unexpected intervention might provide opportunities as well as complications. A local white rancher siding with the Lakota could complicate his narrative about lawless Indians threatening legitimate business operations, but it might also give him a chance to demonstrate his reasonableness by offering Jake a way to avoid the consequences of choosing the wrong side. "Well, Mr. Mitchell," Crawford said, his tone becoming more conciliatory, "I can understand your concern for your neighbors, even if they are Indians. But this is a legal matter that doesn't require outside intervention. These people are squatting on my property and interfering with my cattle operations. All I'm asking is that they move along and find somewhere else to camp." Jake had been expecting this approach, the attempt to frame the situation as a reasonable request being unreasonably refused. It was the same strategy that had allowed men like Crawford to acquire vast holdings throughout the territory while maintaining the appearance of acting within the law. But Jake had seen Maria's documents, and he understood the larger context that Crawford was trying to conceal. "That's an interesting perspective," Jake replied, his voice remaining calm and conversational despite the tension of the moment. "But I have to wonder about your legal claim to this particular piece of ground. See, I've been doing some research lately, talking to folks in the territorial capital who know about such things, and I've heard some disturbing stories about irregularities in certain land transactions." The change in Crawford's expression was subtle but unmistakable. a slight tightening around his eyes that suggested Jake had touched on something he preferred not to discuss publicly. The rancher's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his hands moving closer to his weapons in a way that could have been unconscious, but probably wasn't. "I don't know what kind of stories you've been hearing," Crawford said, his voice cooling noticeably, "but I can assure you that my ownership of this land is completely legal and properly documented. If you have specific concerns about my property rights, you're welcome to take them up with the Territorial Land Office." Jake nodded as if considering this suggestion seriously, though he had no intention of allowing Crawford to control the direction of their conversation. The key was to keep the rancher talking while making it clear that the situation was more complicated than a simple eviction of trespassing Indians. "That's exactly what I plan to do," Jake said. "In fact, I've already been in contact with a clerk named Klaus Brennan who's been investigating some interesting discrepancies in various survey documents and title transfers. Seems there might be questions about whether certain pieces of property were ever legal to sell in the first place." The mention of Brennan's name had an immediate effect on Crawford, though he tried to conceal his reaction. Jake could see the rancher's mind racing, trying to determine how much Jake actually knew and how serious a threat he represented to Crawford's carefully constructed empire. The silence stretched for several seconds before Crawford responded, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, Mitchell, but I'd advise you to be very careful about making accusations you can't substantiate. A man's reputation is a fragile thing out here, and false claims about another man's business dealings can have serious consequences." The threat was clear enough, but Jake had passed the point where personal safety was his primary concern. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him, the sense that this moment would be remembered and judged by future generations, who would want to know whether their ancestors had stood up for what was right when it mattered most. "I'm not making accusations," Jake said, his voice steady and clear. "I'm just asking questions that any reasonable man would want answered before supporting the forced removal of families from land they consider sacred. If your claim to this property is as solid as you say it is, then you shouldn't have any objection to having it examined by neutral parties." Crawford's patience was clearly reaching its limits, his face flushing with anger and frustration. He had come here expecting to intimidate a small group of Indians into abandoning their position, not to defend his business practices before an audience of potential witnesses. The presence of a local white rancher asking uncomfortable questions was turning what should have been a simple power play into a much more complex political situation. Behind Crawford, Jake could see some of his men growing restless, hands drifting toward weapons as they sensed their employer's rising anger. The careful discipline of their approach was beginning to fray as individual personalities and temperaments asserted themselves. This was often the most dangerous moment in such confrontations, when leadership control weakened and volatile individuals began making their own decisions about how to proceed. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain across the ridge. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, its voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Jake found himself thinking about his father's stories, about the importance of choosing the right moment to take a stand and the courage required to see such choices through to their conclusion. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring until Crawford finally dismounted, his boots hitting the rocky ground with deliberate force. He handed his reins to one of his men and began walking toward Jake with the measured pace of a predator approaching cornered prey. Everything about his movement suggested confidence and control, but Jake could see something else in his eyes now, a flicker of uncertainty that hadn't been there when he'd first arrived with his small army of hired guns. Crawford stopped about 10 feet away from Jake, close enough that their conversation would be clearly audible to both groups, but far enough to maintain the formal distance that frontier etiquette demanded during such confrontations. Up close, the rancher was even more imposing than Jake had expected. standing well over 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders and thick hands of a man who had done physical labor before wealth and position allowed him to delegate such tasks to others. "Mr. Mitchell," Crawford said, his voice taking on the tone of reasonable authority that had served him well in countless business negotiations, "I can see that you're a man who cares about his community and wants to do the right thing. That's admirable. And it's exactly the kind of civic responsibility that's made this territory a place where decent folks can build something worthwhile for their families." Jake remained silent, recognizing the beginning of what his father would have called a honey trap, the kind of flattering approach that successful manipulators used to make their targets feel important while steering them toward predetermined conclusions. Crawford was clearly a master of this technique, his words carefully chosen to establish common ground, while positioning himself as the voice of civilization and progress. The rancher continued, his tone becoming more confidential, as if he were sharing important secrets with a trusted ally. "The truth is, what's happening here today is about much more than just moving a few Indian families away from my cattle operations. This entire valley is on the verge of a transformation that could bring prosperity to everyone who's willing to embrace the opportunities that progress offers." Crawford gestured broadly toward the rolling landscape that stretched away in all directions, his expression taking on the enthusiasm of a man describing a grand vision. "Within 5 years, maybe less, there's going to be a railroad depot right here in this valley, connecting us to markets in Chicago, Denver, and San Francisco. The cattle business alone will be worth millions of dollars annually. And that doesn't even account for the mining possibilities or the agricultural development that will follow once we have reliable transportation." Jake could feel the pull of Crawford's vision, the seductive appeal of prosperity and development that had drawn countless men westward in search of fortune. There was undeniable truth in what the rancher was saying about the economic potential of railroad development. And Jake had to admit that his own modest operation would benefit enormously from better access to Eastern markets. But he also remembered Maria's documents and the evidence of corruption and fraud that lay beneath Crawford's legitimate-sounding business plans. Now Crawford continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "I understand your concern for the Indian families who've been camping here. They're your neighbors, and you feel a sense of responsibility toward them. That's commendable, but you need to understand that what they're asking for simply isn't practical in the modern world. This land is too valuable for legitimate development to be held hostage by sentimental attachments to burial grounds that may or may not actually exist." The casual dismissal of the sacred sites sent a flash of anger through Jake, but he kept his expression neutral, allowing Crawford to continue revealing his true attitudes and intentions. The rancher's mask was slipping slightly now, his genuine contempt for native traditions becoming visible beneath the veneer of reasonable concern. "What I'm proposing," Crawford said, leaning forward slightly as if sharing a confidential business proposition, "is a solution that benefits everyone involved. I'm prepared to offer these families compensation for any inconvenience they've experienced, enough money to help them relocate to more suitable accommodations elsewhere in the territory. And I'm also prepared to discuss opportunities for local ranchers like yourself to participate in the development projects that are coming to this area." Jake could see the trap being laid out before him with crystalline clarity. Crawford was offering him a choice between prosperity and principle, betting that practical considerations would outweigh moral obligations when the stakes were high enough. It was the same choice that had been offered to countless men throughout the history of the frontier, and Jake knew that his response would define not just his own character, but his place in the community for years to come. "That's a generous offer," Jake said carefully, buying time while he considered how to respond. "But I have to wonder about a few things before I could consider any kind of business arrangement. For instance, I'm curious about how you acquired the legal rights to this particular piece of land, especially given some of the irregularities that seemed to exist in the territorial land records. Crawford's expression hardened almost imperceptibly, the mask of reasonable businessman slipping another notch to reveal the ruthless operator beneath. He had clearly hoped to resolve this situation through persuasion and financial incentives, but Jake's continued questions about his land claims were forcing him toward more direct forms of intimidation. "I've already told you that my ownership of this property is completely legal and properly documented," Crawford said, his voice taking on an edge that hadn't been there before. "If you're going to continue making insinuations about my business practices, I think you should be prepared to back up those claims with something more substantial than gossip and speculation." The threat was becoming more explicit now, Crawford's carefully maintained facade of civility beginning to crack under the pressure of unexpected resistance. Jake could see the rancher's men shifting restlessly behind him, hands moving closer to weapons as they sensed their employer's growing frustration. The situation was approaching a tipping point where words would no longer be sufficient to resolve the underlying conflict. It was at this crucial moment that another voice entered the conversation, speaking from somewhere behind Jake with the calm authority of someone accustomed to diffusing volatile situations. Deputy Sheriff Bill Hawkins had arrived, apparently, having ridden hard to catch up with Crawford's expedition, and his presence immediately changed the dynamics of the confrontation. "Gentlemen," Hawkins said as he approached on foot, having left his horse at the bottom of the ridge, "I can see we've got ourselves a situation here that needs some official attention. Mr. Crawford, I got your message about the trespassing problem, and I'm here to provide whatever assistance territorial law requires." Jake turned to face the deputy, noting the way Hawkins positioned himself slightly closer to Crawford than to the Lakota camp, a subtle but clear indication of where his sympathies lay. The deputy was a lean, nervous man in his 40s, with the kind of mustache that suggested he spent considerable time in front of a mirror and clothes that were too clean for someone who supposedly spent his days enforcing law in rough country. Hawkins continued, his voice taking on the official tone that lawmen used when they wanted to sound authoritative. "I've been reviewing the relevant statutes and regulations, and it's clear that we've got a situation here where territorial law is being violated by the continued presence of these Indian families on private property. Mr. Crawford has been more than patient in trying to resolve this matter through negotiation, but patience has its limits." Thomas Ravenfeather had been watching this exchange from his position near the camp, and now he stepped forward to join the conversation, his dignity intact despite the implicit threats being directed at his people. The old man's presence seemed to add weight to the air itself, as if the spirits of his ancestors were gathering around him in preparation for whatever was to come. "Deputy Hawkins," Thomas said, his English formal and precise, "I would be interested to see the documents that establish Mr. Crawford's legal claim to this particular piece of land. My granddaughter has been researching such matters in the territorial capital, and she has discovered some interesting discrepancies in the official records that might be relevant to the situation." Hawkins looked uncomfortable at the suggestion, his eyes darting between Thomas and Crawford as if seeking guidance about how to respond. It was clear that he had not expected to encounter legal challenges to Crawford's property claims, and his limited understanding of territorial law was inadequate to deal with the complexities that Maria's research had uncovered. Crawford stepped in before his ally could respond, his voice taking on the tone of injured innocence that politicians used when their integrity was questioned. "I'm frankly insulted by these continued insinuations about my legal rights to property that I purchased in good faith through proper territorial channels. If these people have specific allegations to make, they're welcome to file formal complaints with the appropriate authorities and let the courts sort out any disputes." But Crawford continued, his tone becoming harder, "What we have here is not a legal dispute, but a simple case of trespassing and obstruction of legitimate business activities. These families have been camping on my property for weeks without permission, interfering with my cattle operations and creating safety hazards. For my employees, Deputy Hawkins has a clear obligation under territorial law to remove them immediately. Jake could see the trap closing around Thomas and his people, the way legal technicalities and bureaucratic procedures were being used to justify what was essentially an act of theft and desecration. The system was rigged in favor of men like Crawford, who had the money and connections to manipulate territorial officials and law enforcement officers. Fighting such corruption through official channels would take years, assuming it was possible at all. And by then the burial grounds would have been destroyed and the railroad development would be a fait accompli. It was becoming clear that this confrontation would not be resolved through legal arguments or appeals to justice. Crawford had too much at stake to back down now, and he had positioned himself to use territorial law enforcement as a weapon against anyone who challenged his authority. The time for words was running out, and soon everyone present would be forced to choose between submission and resistance. Jake found himself thinking about his father's stories again, particularly the one about the cattle drive where Robert Mitchell had risked everything to broker peace between cowboys and Kiowa warriors. The parallels were not exact, but the underlying principle was the same. Sometimes a man had to step forward into danger when he saw injustice being perpetrated against people who couldn't defend themselves through conventional means. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the scent of rain from the distant mountains. Clouds were beginning to gather on the western horizon, suggesting that weather might soon add another complication to an already volatile situation. Jake could hear horses snorting and stamping behind him, both his own mare and the mounts of Crawford's men growing restless as they sensed the tension in the air. Deputy Hawkins cleared his throat, preparing to deliver what was clearly intended to be an official ultimatum that would provide legal cover for whatever actions Crawford chose to take. But before he could speak, Maria Thunderhorse emerged from the camp carrying a leather portfolio that Jake recognized as containing the documents she had obtained from Klaus Brennan in the territorial capital. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice calm and professional despite the obvious danger of the situation, "before any official actions are taken based on disputed property claims, I believe you should examine these documents that were obtained from the Territorial Land Office. They contain information that directly bears on the question of legal ownership of this land." Crawford's reaction to Maria's appearance was immediate and telling. His face flushed with anger, and his hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm before he caught himself and forced his expression back under control. It was clear that he recognized her as a more serious threat than an elderly man and a small group of traditional families camping around some old graves. "I don't know who this woman thinks she is," Crawford said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage, "but I'm not going to stand here and listen to more wild accusations and forged documents from people who have no legal standing in this matter. Deputy Hawkins, I want these trespassers removed from my property immediately, using whatever force is necessary to accomplish that objective." The moment of final decision had arrived. Jake could feel it in the air like the electric charge that preceded a thunderstorm, the sense that events had reached a point where they would either explode into violence or find some unexpected resolution that no one had anticipated. Everything hung in the balance, waiting for someone to make the move that would determine the fate of everyone present. Part 7. The proposition. Deputy Hawkins stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun belt in a gesture that was meant to convey official authority, but mostly revealed his own nervousness about the situation he found himself in. The deputy had clearly expected this to be a routine eviction of some troublesome Indians, not a complex legal and political confrontation involving disputed land claims and potential corruption charges. His limited experience in such matters was showing, and Jake could see him struggling to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his comprehension. "Now folks," Hawkins said, his voice carrying a slight tremor that undermined his attempt at authoritative calm, I think we all need to step back and remember that this is a matter for the territorial courts to decide, not something that's going to be settled by arguing on a hillside. What I need right now is for everyone to cooperate with the lawful orders of a duly appointed peace officer." Thomas Ravenfeather regarded the deputy with the patient expression of a man who had dealt with countless government officials over the decades, most of whom had possessed limited understanding of the situations they were attempting to manage. The old Lakota leader's calm dignity stood in sharp contrast to Hawkins' obvious anxiety, and Jake could see that this comparison was not lost on Crawford's men, several of whom were beginning to look uncomfortable with their role in what was starting to resemble harassment more than law enforcement. "Deputy Hawkins," Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of long experience and hard-earned wisdom, "my people have been in this valley for more generations than your government has existed. We have buried our dead in this sacred earth and conducted our ceremonies in these hills since before your grandfathers crossed the Great Water. Our claim to this place does not rest on papers signed by men who have never seen this land, but on the deeper law that connects all living things to the earth that sustains them." The old man's words seemed to hang in the air like smoke from a sacred fire, carrying implications that went far beyond the immediate dispute over property rights. Jake could feel something shifting in the atmosphere around them, a sense that forces larger than human politics and economic interests were beginning to assert themselves in this confrontation. Several of Crawford's horses began moving restlessly. Their ears pricked forward as if they were hearing sounds that the humans present could not detect. Crawford clearly sensed that he was losing control of the narrative that he had hoped to establish, his simple story of lawful property owners dealing with troublesome trespassers becoming complicated by questions about the deeper meanings of ownership and belonging. His political instincts told him that he needed to regain the initiative quickly, before sympathy for the Lakota position began to spread among the neutral observers. "That's all very poetic," Crawford said, his tone dismissive but with an undercurrent of growing desperation. "But poetry doesn't change the reality of territorial law and legally documented property rights. I have deeds, surveys, and official papers that establish my ownership of this land, while these people have nothing but stories and superstitions to support their claims." It was then that Maria stepped forward, opening her leather portfolio and withdrawing a document that bore several official seals and signatures. The paper appeared to be quite old, yellow with age, but still clearly legible, and even from a distance Jake could see that it contained both English text and what appeared to be detailed maps drawn in different colored inks. "Actually, Mr. Crawford," Maria said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had spent years learning to navigate the complexities of territorial law and federal regulations, "we have considerably more than stories to support our position. This is a copy of the original treaty signed between the Lakota Nation and the United States government in 1868, specifically designating this area as protected tribal territory that could not be sold or transferred without explicit federal approval and compensation to the affected tribes." She held the document up so that everyone present could see the official seals and signatures that authenticated its legal status. Even Crawford's men seemed impressed by the formal appearance of the treaty, and Jake could see doubt beginning to creep into their expressions as they realized that this situation might be more complicated than their employer had led them to believe. Furthermore, Maria continued, "Klaus Brennan's research in the Territorial Land Office has uncovered evidence that the surveys used to justify your property claims were deliberately falsified to include lands that were never legally available for private purchase. The original federal surveys from the 1870s clearly show this area as being outside the boundaries of any territory offered for civilian settlement." Crawford's face had gone pale beneath his tan, and Jake could see the rancher's mind racing as he tried to assess how much damage these revelations might do to his carefully constructed empire of dubious land claims. The presence of an authentic federal treaty, combined with evidence of fraudulent surveys, represented exactly the kind of legal challenge that could unravel years of profitable but questionable business dealings. Deputy Hawkins looked completely out of his depth now, his limited understanding of territorial law clearly inadequate to deal with the constitutional and federal treaty issues that Maria's documents had introduced into the dispute. He kept glancing between Crawford and the treaty as if hoping that someone would tell him how to respond to this unexpected development. "Those are serious accusations you're making, young lady," Hawkins said finally, his voice uncertain despite his attempt to sound official. "But I'm not qualified to evaluate the authenticity of federal treaties or investigate allegations of survey fraud. Those are matters that would need to be reviewed by territorial judges and federal officials with appropriate expertise." Crawford seized on the deputy's uncertainty, recognizing an opportunity to regain some measure of control over the situation. "Exactly right, Deputy," he said, his voice taking on renewed confidence. "These people are making wild claims based on documents that could easily be forgeries or misinterpretations of complex legal language. What we need here is immediate action to deal with an ongoing trespass situation, not a lengthy legal debate about historical treaties." But even as Crawford spoke, Jake could see that the momentum of the confrontation was shifting in ways that the rancher had not anticipated. Several of his own men were beginning to look uncomfortable with their role in what was starting to appear more like claim jumping than legitimate law enforcement. The presence of authentic-looking federal documents had raised questions about the legal foundation of Crawford's position that could not be easily dismissed. It was at this crucial moment that the sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention toward the southern approach to Whispering Pine Ridge. A small group of riders was climbing toward them at a steady pace, and even from a distance Jake could see that these newcomers were different from the cowboys and hired guns who had accompanied Crawford. Their clothing and equipment suggested government officials or perhaps military personnel, and their purposeful approach indicated that their arrival was not coincidental. Crawford's expression darkened as he recognized the lead rider, a tall man in a dark coat who sat his horse with the rigid posture of someone accustomed to military discipline. Behind him rode two other men in similar attire, along with a fourth figure whose civilian clothes and surveying equipment marked him as probably being a territorial land office employee. "That's Captain Morrison from the territorial government," Crawford said, his voice tight with apprehension. "He must have received word about the situation here." Thomas Ravenfeather watched the approaching officials with the calm attention of a man who had learned to read the intentions of government representatives through decades of often disappointing experience. But Jake thought he could detect a subtle shift in the old man's posture, a slight relaxation that suggested these particular arrivals might represent something other than the usual pattern of official harassment and broken promises. Captain Morrison dismounted while still several yards away from the main group, his movements economical and precise in the way of career military officers. He was a man in his late 40s with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent in challenging frontier conditions. His uniform was clean but practical, without the ostentatious decorations that some territorial officials favored, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned his authority through competence rather than political connections. "Gentlemen," Captain Morrison said, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question, "I understand we have a situation here that requires official attention. I've been sent by the territorial governor to investigate reports of disputed land claims and potential violations of federal treaty obligations." Crawford started to speak, clearly intending to present his version of events first, but Morrison raised a hand to forestall him. The captain's attention had fixed on Maria and the document she still held, and Jake could see recognition in his eyes that suggested he might already know more about this situation than any of them had expected. "Miss Thunderhorse," Morrison said, addressing Maria directly, I believe you've been in correspondence with officials in the territorial capital regarding irregularities in certain land office records. I've been reviewing your materials, along with the findings of Mr. Brennan's investigation, and I have some questions that need to be answered before this matter can be properly resolved. The captain's words sent a visible shock through Crawford, whose face had gone from pale to ashen as he realized that his problems extended far beyond this local confrontation. If Morrison had been reviewing Maria's evidence and Brennan's findings, it meant that the territorial government was taking the allegations of fraud and corruption seriously enough to launch an official investigation. Jake found himself in the unusual position of watching a man's empire begin to crumble in real time. Crawford had built his wealth and influence on a foundation of carefully concealed fraud, betting that the complexity of territorial land law and the remoteness of his operations would protect him from serious scrutiny. But Maria's research and Brennan's discovery of the documentary evidence had exposed the fundamental illegitimacy of his claims at precisely the moment when railroad development was making those lands too valuable to escape federal attention. Deputy Hawkins seemed to be shrinking visibly as he realized that he had allowed himself to become Crawford's tool in what was apparently a much larger criminal conspiracy. The deputy's limited intelligence had made him useful to Crawford as someone who would follow orders without asking too many questions, but that same limitation now left him completely unprepared to deal with the consequences of his complicity. Captain Morrison continued, his tone becoming more formal as he shifted into official mode. Based on the evidence that's been presented to territorial authorities, there are grounds for serious concern about the validity of certain property claims in this area. Until those concerns can be properly investigated and resolved, I'm placing this entire section of land under temporary federal protection, pending a complete review of all relevant documentation. The captain's words hit Crawford like a physical blow, and Jake could see the rancher struggling to maintain his composure as the implications of this development became clear. A federal investigation would inevitably uncover the full extent of his fraudulent activities, destroying not only his empire, but quite possibly resulting in criminal charges that could see him spending years in a territorial prison. Furthermore, Morrison continued, any attempts to interfere with this investigation or to intimidate potential witnesses will be considered federal crimes, punishable by imprisonment and substantial fines. I'm directing all parties to maintain the current status quo until proper legal determinations can be made through appropriate channels. Crawford's men had been listening to this exchange with growing unease, and Jake could see several of them beginning to edge their horses away from their employer as they realized that their association with him might soon become a serious liability. The smart ones were already calculating how to distance themselves from Crawford's operations before the federal investigation began examining everyone who had been involved in his questionable business practices. The situation had been completely transformed within the space of a few minutes, the balance of power shifting so dramatically that what had begun as Crawford's attempt to intimidate a small group of native families had become the first act in his own downfall. The arrival of federal authority had changed all the rules of the game, introducing consequences that extended far beyond the immediate dispute over burial grounds. Part 8. Negotiation and hesitation. The silence that followed. Captain Morrison's pronouncement stretched across Whispering Pine Ridge like the calm before a thunderstorm, heavy with implications that no one present had fully anticipated when the day began. Crawford sat his black stallion with the rigid posture of a man trying to process the complete collapse of everything he had worked to build over the past decade, while his hired men exchanged uneasy glances that spoke of suddenly uncertain loyalties and rapidly shifting calculations about their own futures. Jake could see the wheels turning in Crawford's mind as the rancher tried to find some angle, some argument or leverage that might allow him to salvage something from this disaster. Crawford had not become one of the most powerful men in the territory by accepting defeat easily, and Jake suspected that the rancher would attempt some desperate gambit rather than simply submit to the federal investigation that would inevitably destroy him. Captain Morrison seemed to anticipate this possibility, his attention remaining fixed on Crawford, with the steady gaze of a man who had dealt with cornered adversaries before and understood the dangers they represented. The captain's civilian companions had spread out slightly, positioning themselves to observe the reactions of all parties while remaining close enough to provide assistance if the situation deteriorated into violence. The surveyor who had accompanied Morrison was already unpacking his equipment, preparing to conduct what appeared to be an official examination of the disputed boundaries. This man, probably Klaus Brennan himself based on his obvious familiarity with the documents Maria had provided, worked with the methodical precision of someone who understood that his measurements and observations would become crucial evidence in whatever legal proceedings followed. Thomas Ravenfeather had been watching these developments with the patient attention of a man who had learned to read the complex dynamics of conflicts between his people and various levels of government authority. The old Lakota leader's expression suggested cautious optimism, but Jake could see that he remained alert to the possibility that this apparent victory might prove temporary or come with costs that had not yet become apparent. Maria moved closer to her grandfather, speaking quietly in their native language while gesturing toward the federal officials and their equipment. Thomas nodded occasionally, his responses equally quiet but carrying the weight of someone making important decisions about how to proceed. Jake found himself wondering what strategic considerations they were discussing, what opportunities and dangers they saw in this sudden transformation of their situation. Crawford finally broke the silence, his voice tight with barely controlled desperation as he attempted to challenge Morrison's authority. "Captain," he said, "I hope you understand that you're interfering with legitimate business operations that represent millions of dollars in investment and employment for this territory. The economic consequences of delaying railroad development could affect thousands of families throughout Montana." Morrison's response was delivered with the flat authority of someone who had dealt with similar arguments countless times before. "Mr. Crawford," he said, "economic considerations, however significant, do not supersede federal law or treaty obligations. If your business operations are based on fraudulent land claims, then any economic benefits they might generate are ultimately illegitimate regardless of their scale." The captain paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "Furthermore, I should point out that the territorial governor has received significant pressure from federal authorities to investigate allegations of corruption in land office operations. Your situation is part of a much larger pattern of irregularities that have come to the attention of officials in Washington, and there will be no exceptions made for political or economic convenience." Jake could see Crawford's face cycling through various emotions as the full implications of Morrison's words became clear. The rancher was not just facing the loss of his fraudulent claims to Whispering Pine Ridge. He was apparently part of a territorial-wide investigation that could expose and destroy an entire network of corrupt officials and illegal business practices. The stakes were far higher than anyone had initially realized, and Crawford's position far more precarious than his confident arrival had suggested. Deputy Hawkins cleared his throat nervously, clearly trying to find some way to extricate himself from his association with Crawford's operations. "Captain Morrison," he said, his voice unsteady, "I want to make it clear that I was simply responding to what I believed were legitimate reports of trespassing. If there are questions about the legal foundation of those reports, then obviously I have no authority to take action until those questions are resolved." Morrison's gaze shifted to the deputy with obvious contempt for the man's attempt to distance himself from his earlier threats and posturing. "Deputy Hawkins," the captain said, "your actions here today will be thoroughly reviewed as part of our investigation. I suggest you confine yourself to documenting the current situation rather than taking any steps that might be construed as interfering with federal proceedings. The rebuke was clear enough to make Hawkins visibly wince, and Jake could see the deputy beginning to understand that his association with Crawford might cost him his badge at minimum, and possibly result in criminal charges if the investigation uncovered evidence of deliberate corruption rather than mere incompetence. It was then that Crawford made his desperate gambit, his voice taking on the threatening tone of a man who had decided that he had nothing left to lose. "Captain Morrison," he said, "I think you should consider very carefully the implications of what you're doing here. I have friends in the territorial government and business connections throughout the region who won't take kindly to seeing their interests disrupted by federal interference based on forged documents and Indian superstitions." The threat was clear. Enough. And Jake could see Morrison's hand move almost imperceptibly closer to his sidearm as he evaluated Crawford's words and demeanor. Several of Crawford's men shifted uneasily in their saddles, clearly uncomfortable with their employer's decision to threaten a federal official in front of multiple witnesses. Morrison's response was delivered with the cold precision of a man who had faced down more dangerous adversaries than a corrupt rancher. "Mr. Crawford," he said, "I'm going to pretend that I didn't hear you threaten a federal investigation, because the penalties for such actions are quite severe, and I'd prefer not to add those charges to what I suspect will already be a lengthy list of criminal allegations against you." The captain's tone became even more ominous as he continued. "However, I will note that any attempts to interfere with this investigation, whether through political pressure, witness intimidation, or other means, will be documented and forwarded to federal authorities who take a very dim view of such activities. I suggest you focus your energy on obtaining competent legal representation rather than on making threats you lack the power to carry out." Crawford's face had gone from pale to flushed as Morrison's words struck home, and Jake could see the rancher struggling with the realization that his threats had not only failed to intimidate the federal official, but had actually worsened his already desperate position. The careful political network that had protected Crawford's illegal activities was apparently crumbling under federal pressure, leaving him isolated and vulnerable. Several of Crawford's hired men were beginning to edge their horses away from the main group, clearly deciding that continued association with their employer represented a serious threat to their own freedom and livelihood. The smart ones had already recognized that Crawford's empire was collapsing, and that anyone who remained loyal to him would likely share his fate when the federal investigation reached its conclusion. Jake found himself feeling an unexpected moment of sympathy for Crawford, despite everything the man had done and attempted to do. There was something almost tragic about watching a powerful man's world disintegrate so completely and so quickly, especially when that disintegration was the direct result of his own greed and hubris. Crawford had possessed wealth, influence, and opportunity, but his inability to be satisfied with legitimate success had ultimately destroyed everything he had built. Thomas Ravenfeather stepped forward, his movement drawing everyone's attention back to the fundamental issues that had brought them all to this confrontation. "Captain Morrison," the old man said, his voice carrying the dignity and authority of a tribal elder, "my people are grateful for your intervention in this matter, but we must speak plainly about what happens next." The old Lakota leader paused, his gaze encompassing everyone present as he prepared to address the larger implications of the day's events. "This sacred ground has been threatened not just by one man's greed, but by a pattern of disrespect and exploitation that has characterized the relationship between our peoples for many generations. Your investigation may restore our legal rights to this place, but it cannot restore the trust that has been broken or heal the wounds that have been inflicted." Thomas's words carried a weight that went far beyond the immediate legal and political issues, touching on deeper questions about justice, reconciliation, and the possibility of building genuine understanding between communities with very different worldviews. Jake could see that Morrison was listening with more than professional attention, his expression suggesting a personal engagement with these larger moral questions. What we seek, Thomas continued, is not merely the protection of our burial grounds, but the establishment of a framework for mutual respect that will prevent such conflicts from arising in the future. The spirits of our ancestors call out for justice, but they also call for wisdom and healing that can benefit all the peoples of this valley. Morrison nodded slowly, his response suggesting that he understood the complexity of what Thomas was proposing. "Mr. Ravenfeather," the captain said, "the federal government's obligation is to enforce existing treaty obligations and investigate violations of federal law. Those are important responsibilities, but they represent only part of what's needed to address the historical injustices you're describing." The captain paused, considering his words carefully before continuing. "However, I can assure you that this investigation will be conducted with full respect for your rights and interests, and that any resolution will include provisions for protecting this sacred site in perpetuity. Beyond that, I hope that local communities can find ways to build on this legal foundation to create the kind of mutual understanding you're advocating." Jake realized that he was witnessing something remarkable, a moment when federal authority was being used not to suppress native rights, but to protect them against local corruption and exploitation. It was the kind of outcome that his father had dreamed of, but rarely seen during his own lifetime. A genuine alliance between federal law and tribal justice that offered hope for a more equitable future. Crawford had been listening to this exchange with growing desperation, clearly recognizing that his last hopes for avoiding the consequences of his actions were slipping away. The rancher's earlier confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by the haunted expression of a man who could see his doom approaching but lacked the power to prevent it. "Captain Morrison," Crawford said, his voice now carrying a pleading tone that was painful to hear, "surely we can find some way to resolve this situation that doesn't require destroying everything I've built here. I'm willing to compensate these people generously for any inconvenience, and I can guarantee that the burial grounds will be respected and protected as part of any future development plans." Morrison's expression remained impassive as he considered Crawford's desperate offer. "Mr. Crawford," the captain said, "the time for negotiated settlements was before you initiated fraudulent land claims and attempted to intimidate federal treaty beneficiaries. At this point, the matter is beyond local resolution and must be addressed through proper federal channels." The finality in Morrison's voice made it clear that Crawford's fate was sealed, and Jake could see the rancher beginning to understand that his empire of fraudulent land claims would not survive the federal investigation that was now inevitable. The man who had arrived that morning with 20 armed men and absolute confidence in his power was leaving as a broken figure facing criminal prosecution and financial ruin. The morning sun had climbed higher as Jake Mitchell found himself standing at the crossroads of his life, Crawford's desperate offer hanging in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. The rancher's words carried the weight of genuine desperation now. His earlier confidence completely evaporated in the face of federal intervention and the collapse of his carefully constructed empire of fraudulent land claims. But beneath the desperation, Jake could still hear the calculating mind of a man who had built his fortune by exploiting others' weaknesses and finding ways to turn crisis into opportunity. Crawford continued his pitch, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper that carried just far enough for Jake to hear clearly. "Listen to me carefully," he said, his eyes darting briefly toward Captain Morrison and the federal officials before returning to fix on Jake with laser intensity. "These government men think they've got everything figured out, but they don't understand the realities of frontier business. Investigations take years, appeals take longer, and in the meantime, smart men position themselves to benefit from the chaos." The rancher's hand gestured subtly toward the rolling landscape that stretched away from Whispering Pine Ridge. encompassing thousands of acres of prime grazing land and potential development sites. "Even if I lose this particular piece of ground," Crawford said, "there are dozens of other opportunities in this valley for men with vision and courage. Railroad development is coming whether these Indians like it or not, and the men who get in early will make fortunes that dwarf anything we're arguing about today." Jake could feel the seductive pull of Crawford's vision, the promise of wealth and influence that had drawn countless men into compromising their principles for the sake of financial opportunity. There was undeniable truth in what the rancher was saying about the economic potential of railroad development, and Jake's practical mind couldn't help calculating how much his modest operation might benefit from the kind of partnership Crawford was proposing. But even as he considered the financial possibilities, Jake found himself remembering his father's stories about the choices that defined a man's character and determined the legacy he would leave behind. Robert Mitchell had faced similar moments of temptation during his own life, opportunities to profit from questionable dealings, or to look the other way while others were exploited for economic gain. In every case, he had chosen principle over profit, and while that had sometimes meant financial hardship, it had also meant that he could face himself in the mirror each morning without shame. Crawford seemed to sense Jake's internal struggle, and he pressed his advantage with the skill of a man who had spent years persuading others to abandon their scruples for the promise of shared prosperity. "Think about your future, Mitchell," the rancher said, his voice taking on an almost fatherly tone. "You're a young man with your whole life ahead of you, and this valley is about to be transformed in ways that will create opportunities beyond anything you can imagine. Don't let misplaced sentiment about Indian superstitions cost you the chance to build something real for yourself and your family." The reference to family hit Jake with unexpected force, reminding him that his decisions today would affect not just his own future, but the lives of any children he might have and the kind of world he would leave for them to inherit. Did he want to raise his children in a community where might made right and where the powerful could trample the rights of the weak with impunity? Or did he want to help build something better, a place where justice and honor meant more than profit margins and political connections? Jake's gaze drifted across the landscape toward the ancient burial grounds that had sparked this entire confrontation, those weathered stone markers that represented centuries of tribal history and spiritual tradition. He thought about Thomas, Raven Feather's great-grandfather, the holy man who had received visions of this very moment, and the choice that would determine the spiritual future of the valley. Whether or not one believed in such mystical insights, there was something undeniably powerful about the continuity of generations, the responsibility each person bore to honor those who had come before and protect the inheritance of those who would come after. Crawford was still talking, his words flowing with practiced persuasion as he painted increasingly elaborate pictures of the wealth and influence that awaited those wise enough to ally themselves with progress rather than tradition. But Jake found that the rancher's voice was beginning to fade into background noise, overwhelmed by other sounds that seemed to be growing stronger despite the unnatural stillness that had settled over the ridge. It started as a whisper so faint that Jake initially dismissed it as wind moving through the grass or the distant cry of birds. But gradually, the sound took on more definition, resolving into what might have been voices speaking in a language he didn't recognize, chanting or singing words that carried emotional weight even though their meaning remained obscure. The sound seemed to be coming from the direction of the burial grounds themselves, rising and falling in rhythms that felt both ancient and immediate. Jake glanced around to see if others were hearing the same phenomenon, and he noticed that several of the Lakota defenders had lifted their heads with expressions of wonder and recognition. Thomas Ravenfeather in particular was standing perfectly still, his eyes closed and his face tilted slightly upward as if listening to something that carried profound significance. Even some of Crawford's men seemed to be affected, their horses dancing nervously beneath them as they responded to stimuli their riders couldn't consciously detect. Crawford himself appeared oblivious to these subtle changes in the atmosphere, too focused on his desperate sales pitch to notice anything beyond his immediate objectives. The rancher was still talking about partnership opportunities and shared profits, his voice taking on an increasingly frantic edge as he sensed that his window of opportunity was rapidly closing. But his words seemed to be coming from a great distance now, overwhelmed by the growing presence of something far older and more powerful than human ambition. It was then that Jake experienced something that would stay with him for the rest of his life, a moment of clarity so complete and overwhelming that it felt like stepping out of a darkened room into brilliant sunlight. The voices he had been hearing suddenly became clear, not in their words but in their meaning, conveying a message that transcended language and spoke directly to his heart and soul. The spirits of the ancestors were indeed present, just as Thomas had claimed, and they were calling out not for vengeance but for justice, not for the destruction of those who had wronged them, but for the restoration of balance and harmony that would benefit all the peoples of the valley. They had been waiting through decades of encroachment and exploitation for someone to stand up and say that enough was enough, that there were things more important than profit and more sacred than property rights. Jake felt the weight of generations pressing down on him, not as a burden but as a source of strength and purpose that connected him to something infinitely larger than his own immediate concerns. He thought about his father's friendship with Thomas Revan Feather, about the mutual respect and understanding that had been possible between their peoples when honor and integrity guided their interactions. He thought about the children who would grow up in this valley, both native and white, and the kind of world he wanted to help create for them. When Jake finally spoke, his voice carried a conviction that surprised even himself, ringing across the ridge with the clarity of a church bell on a still morning. "Crawford," he said, turning to face the rancher directly, "I appreciate your offer, I truly do. But I've heard enough to know that your prosperity is built on a foundation of fraud and corruption that will eventually collapse under its own weight. I won't be part of that collapse, and I won't stand by while you destroy something sacred for the sake of profits you'll probably never live to enjoy." Crawford's face went through a series of expressions as Jake's words sank in, moving from surprise to anger to something approaching desperation as he realized that his final gambit had failed. The rancher had been so certain that practical considerations would outweigh moral objections that he had not prepared for the possibility of outright rejection. Now he found himself facing the complete collapse of his empire, with no allies and no escape routes. "You're making a serious mistake, Mitchell," Crawford said, his voice taking on a threatening edge that revealed the brutal calculus that are always underlaying his business dealings. "You think these government men are going to protect you, but investigations end and officials get transferred. I have a long memory, and I don't forget people who interfere with my business operations." Jake felt no fear at Crawford's threat, only a deep sadness for a man who had possessed so much and chosen to risk it all for the sake of acquiring even more. "I reckon we'll have to see about that," Jake replied, his tone remaining calm despite the implicit violence in Crawford's words. "But I'll tell you one thing for certain. I'd rather face whatever consequences come from doing the right thing than live with the knowledge that I helped destroy something sacred for money I didn't earn." It was at this moment that Captain Morrison stepped forward, his intervention cutting through the tension between Jake and Crawford with the authority of federal law. "Mr. Crawford," the captain said, his voice carrying the flat finality of official judgment, "I believe we've heard enough to understand the situation here. You'll be coming with us to face formal charges related to your fraudulent land claims, and I strongly advise you to avoid making any more threats against potential witnesses." Morrison gestured toward two of his men who moved forward with the practiced efficiency of officers who had made countless arrests. Crawford's face cycled through various emotions as the reality of his situation finally penetrated his. denial and desperation. The empire he had spent years building was crumbling around him, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it. Several of Crawford's hired men were already spurring their horses away from the scene, clearly deciding that their employment had ended the moment federal charges were mentioned. The smart ones would be looking for new jobs in distant territories, while the unlucky ones would probably find themselves caught up in the broader investigation that Morrison had hinted at. Only Deputy Hawkins remained, looking stunned and defeated as he contemplated the likely end of his own career in law enforcement. Thomas Ravenfeather approached Jake as the federal officers took Crawford into custody, the old man's face reflecting a mixture of gratitude and profound relief. "The spirits of our ancestors sing with joy today," Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of emotions too deep for ordinary expression. "You have honored not only them, but the memory of your father, who understood that true strength comes from protecting those who cannot protect themselves." Maria Thunderhorse joined them, her face glowing with the satisfaction of seeing justice finally served after years of patient research and preparation. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her formal tone softening into something approaching warmth, "my grandfather is right about the significance of what you've done today. But more than that, you've helped establish a precedent that will protect other sacred sites throughout the territory from similar exploitation." Jake found himself overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had transpired, the way a single morning's decision had apparently altered the trajectory of his entire life and affected the futures of countless others. He had awakened that day as a small rancher struggling to survive a difficult season, and now he found himself at the center of events that would likely reshape the political and cultural landscape of the entire valley. Captain Morrison approached their small group, his official demeanor softening slightly as he addressed the personal dimension of what they had accomplished together. "Mr. Mitchell," the captain said, "I want you to know that your willingness to stand up for what's right has been crucial to the success of this investigation. Without local witnesses willing to testify about Crawford's activities, it would have been much more difficult to build a case that would hold up in federal court." The captain paused, considering his words carefully before continuing. "There will likely be legal proceedings that require your testimony, and I can't promise that the process will be easy or quick. Federal investigations move slowly, and there may be attempts to intimidate or discredit witnesses. But I can assure you that the government takes these matters seriously and will do everything in our power to protect those who help us ensure that justice is served." Jake nodded, understanding that his commitment to doing the right thing would involve ongoing responsibilities and potential dangers that he couldn't fully anticipate. But the voices he had heard, whether real or imagined, had left him with a sense of purpose that transcended his personal concerns. He had been called to play a role in something larger than himself, and he would see that role through to its conclusion regardless of the cost. As the federal officers prepared to depart with their prisoner, Jake found himself looking across the landscape with new eyes, seeing not just grazing land and potential development sites, but a living tapestry of history and culture that connected the present moment to countless generations of struggle and survival. The burial grounds that had seemed like simple stone markers that morning now appeared as focal points of spiritual energy that would continue to influence events in ways that transcended ordinary understanding. The crisis was over, but Jake sensed that his real journey was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.